We return now to sanctions on Russia. As Donald Trump warns of an economic crackdown, the European Union has failed again to get another package of penalties over the line in Brussels. So joining me now in the studio as this story develops is Kinga Redłowska, Head of the Centre for Finance and Security at the Royal United Services Institute of Europe. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good afternoon.
Can I start with Donald Trump's 100% tariff threat? We've seen the markets in Moscow actually respond rather positively to this news. So would Trump's sanctions really hit Putin hard enough?
Well, if President Trump follows through with what he has announced yesterday, I think such unprecedented restrictive measures and economic measures imposed on Russia would hit hard. So
what is it, do you think, that means Moscow's markets responded positively?
Well, so it's very difficult to comment definitively on Donald Trump's stance, as it tends to shift often and significantly. But what President Trump announced yesterday is that if Russia doesn't sit at the negotiation table within the next 50 days, the US will impose severe economic measures on Russia to restrict the revenue Kremlin is generating to wage the illegal war. But when we look closely into the specifics of what President Trump announced and what was later explained by the White House officials, because President Trump coined a new term, secondary tariffs, so later White House officials explained that what he meant actually is that the US will impose tariffs on Russia, which actually is a tool of a relatively low impact, because actually Russia-US trade is relatively low. But he also announced that he would impose tariffs, or as later explained, secondary sanctions on countries and entities that buy Russian oil, Russian energy and Russian minerals. And that could hit hard. It actually, if President Trump follows through, can be a seismic shift in terms of global energy market.
You mentioned seismic shift there. I'm interested in your view more broadly. Do you feel like sanctions are working with Vladimir Putin? I mean, does President Putin sit there in the Kremlin, see what President Trump is threatening, see what Brussels is doing, and maybe thinks twice?
So the aim of sanctions was twofold. First of all, was to restrict Kremlin's revenue, and secondly, to limit the access to advanced dual-use goods. When we look into the restricting of the revenue, the oil price cap, which has been the main G7 tool to achieve this goal, has been successful to some extent at the beginning when it was introduced. But what we see now is that it's clearly not effective. We are seeing more than 90% of Russian crude oil being moved through the so-called shadow fleet. These are poorly insured, difficult to track, often reflagged vessels that are operating under opaque flags and that are facilitating sanctions circumvention just to stay off the radar and continue to generate revenue for Kremlin. There is not enough coordination between international sanctions coalition to actually properly enforce the oil price cap.
So let's talk about that oil price cap. $60 as it stands. There's this proposal as part of the 18th package of sanctions in Brussels that goes down to 45. If that passes, once Slovakia and the EU is able to strike a deal, do you feel like it still has any teeth? Because the US is sceptical on the idea of lowering the oil price cap. And if the US is not on board, is there any point lowering it at all?
The unintended consequence of the oil price cap was the development of the shadow fleet and, importantly, a parallel trading system that facilitates this trade. And so lowering the price cap will not achieve a lot, because whether this is $60 per barrel or $40 per barrel, it's just not being enforced properly. And at the heart of the issue is the problem of the sort of imposing the oil price cap and the enforcement. When we look into the vessels that are transporting Russian oil and Russian transport, there is a high probability that the same shadow ships are transporting and facilitating trade for other UN sanctions regimes, such as DPRK and Iran. But what do we do when we identify a shadow ship, a shadow tanker? How do we make them comply? Well, we don't think about military interception anymore. This is not realistic. This is not something we want. This could trigger naval escalation. We don't want to do that. So what should we do? We should shrink the regulatory space in which the shadow fleet operates to actively and effectively enforce the oil price cap.
So when you mentioned that basically without America's backing, what you're saying is without America's backing, this lowering of the oil price cap will make basically no difference.
If it's not properly enforced. But I still believe that...
Can it be properly enforced without the US?
Yes, it can be. Without the US, the EU has strong tools that it can deploy, especially when we look into the Baltic Sea. We've already seen some enhanced cooperation in regions such as Baltic-Nordic region, where there are some international formats, for example, Baltic-Nordic 8++ format, when the countries are actually boosting the cooperation. And just two words that would make the more price cap more effective, if we look into them: insurance and flags. There should be no vessel operating or entering ports without a valid insurance. Yet, we've seen those shadow ships operating, entering ports, and this insurance is provided by non-transparent insurance providers. Secondly, flags. There are countries that offer flags to vessels. Some countries offer so-called flags of convenience that provide no oversight and allow those ships to hop from one registry to another without scrutiny. And there are tools, regulatory tools, to push those countries that offer those flags of convenience to hold them accountable for what they offer and what they facilitate. There just needs to be more willingness, and the EU needs to be a bit bolder in deploying those tools.
Kinga Redłowska from the Royal United Services Institute of Europe, thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much.
And that's all for World News tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.